Hello, Internet. Today we're talking about
Capitalism.
I wanted to do a video about the intersection of capitalism and our education system, but I figured I should probably do just kind of an overview of my thoughts and feelings towards capitalism first, so that folks can have the background they need to follow that video when it comes out. So, look forward to that video, and subscribe if you don't want to miss it. The goal of this video is to make the ideas behind class consciousness as accessible as possible. So I know a lot of people's knee-jerk responses to discussions about capitalism is to declare that capitalism is the only system that works and move on. And I understand. It can be deeply uncomfortable to entertain ideas that don't mesh with your worldview. If this is you, I would like to ask, would you be willing to suspend your disbelief and hear me out for 20 minutes? You don't need to agree with everything I say, but gosh, it would meet my human needs for harmony, consideration, and hope if you would just chew on my ideas for a bit. Part 1. Capitalism is unjust. Okay, so what do I mean when I say capitalism? Capitalism is a system in which the means of production, that is, the things that produce goods and services, like factories, restaurants, hair salons, etc., are owned by individuals. Socialism, by contrast, is a system in which the means of production are owned collectively by society. The means of what? I thought you said this video was going to be accessible. You know, that's a good point. This video is getting a little abstract, isn't it? Let's look at a concrete example and see if that helps. Imagine you are rich. Congrats, you made it. Now, it's in your best interest to invest your fortune so that you can keep making more money. With this in mind, you decide to purchase a McDonald's franchise. In this example, the means of production would be the restaurant and everything in it. Now, according to Fox Business, each year you own a McDonald's franchise location, it will net you an average of $150,000. But where does that money come from? Well, the short answer is your employees. Each employee produces more value than they are being paid. Otherwise, as a savvy business owner, why would you hire them? According to iBiz World, the average number of employees at a fast food restaurant is around 16. We'll be generous and assume that McDonald's has 20 employees per location. That means that each employee is generating an additional $7,500 a year that you, the owner, get to pocket. And that's just the cut that goes to the franchise owner. McDonald's reported a net profit of over $6 billion last year. That means if it were divided up among their workers, it would work out to about $3,000 each. All of this means that the value generated by each employee that is siphoned off to franchise owners and shareholders, whose major contributions, let me remind you, was owning stuff, is upwards of $10,000 a year. And that's not even accounting for the fact that many of these are part-time employees, or the intrinsic inequality of the corporate structure where the people working office jobs get paid way more than the people doing physical labor in the restaurants. This process of exploitation is called wage labor, and it means that as long as an individual owns the means of production, in this case the restaurant, the employees will not be given the full value of their labor. Now, to my viewers who are new to far-left politics, you may sometimes notice feelings of anger being directed towards billionaires. That anger probably feels scary, unsettling, or even shocking at times. And I just want to take a second and acknowledge your discomfort and your human needs for safety and belonging. I would also encourage you to try to look under the anger to the love that's generating it. Our hearts are breaking for the people who are working and working and working themselves to exhaustion but can never seem to get ahead. And yeah, sometimes that comes out as anger. We're mad at the system that's causing so much pain. We long so deeply for a society where everyone cares for one another and is cared for by one another. So when we see things like how Jeff Bezos has made $80 billion since the start of the pandemic, while millions of people are struggling to just keep a roof over their heads, the glaring injustice of it can be just infuriating at times. Foundational to capitalism are the ideas that money can be used to measure someone's worth, and some people deserve more money than others. Now that may sound callous to you, and I would agree, but it's also true. I mean, consider the following. Why is it irresponsible for a poor person to eat out at restaurants frequently, but not for a rich person? Most people, when presented with a question like this, give something about the necessity of living within your means. But philosophically, what that boils down to is that we, as a society, have decided that the rich person deserves to eat out more. They're worth more. They should be afforded more material comforts, we say, because they produce more value to society. But this is nonsense, though. Like, by this logic, if you are born rich, you are, by default, more valuable to society than someone who is born poor. It doesn't make any sense. The very idea that you can quantitatively identify a person's value to society comes with some very serious moral problems. Like, for example, what does this worldview say about disabled people? As a paraprofessional in an autism classroom, some of the students that I work with may never have a job. In a worldview that equates value as a human being to some quantifiable economic productivity, the logical endpoint is that someone who is not able to work has no value. Now, as a general rule, when your worldview is telling you that some people have no value, it may be time to take a critical look at it. Part 2. Capitalism doesn't optimize innovation. The extent to which capitalism produces innovation is secondary to its primary goal, monetization. Like, if you are able to monetize without innovating, the system encourages you to do so. I mean, we're coming up on, the 6th Disney live-action remake here? Are you telling me that this is the most innovation the human race can produce? Come on. I mean, it's hard to imagine that if we were liberated from the constraints of just trying to make whatever we think is going to sell the best, that thousands of people would have come together to make Dumbo. It seems much more likely to me that people would follow their creative passions and we would get all sorts of unique and interesting and thought-provoking content. Like, imagine what the video game industry would look like if developers weren't forced to just iterate on stale concepts with mass market appeal to make the money they need to live. I mean, instead of getting tons of tiny tweaks on popular formulas constantly regurgitated to us, we would get amazing creative gameplay experiences. Like, the reason why we have more games like Call of Duty than Breath of the Wild is games like Call of Duty tend to be more profitable. They end up with comparable sales figures. In this case, COD actually sells better than Zelda in general. But way more resources go into developing Zelda than Call of Duty. So that means the profit margins are much higher on derivative games. And this is not to say that you should feel bad about liking series like Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed that are just churning out game after game, year after year. I just want to point out that the developer's primary goal is not to create the most engaging and fun gameplay experience. It's to get you to pay the $60 to buy the dang thing as many times as they can. And without deadlines, people would be able to take their time and flesh out their games and allow them to reach their full potential. So, while it's true that capitalism has led to more innovation than the system that we had prior to it, that system was feudalism, so it's a pretty low bar. Part 3. Capitalism isn't human nature. Capitalists tend to act like they have human nature just all figured out, but the philosophy of capitalism isn't rooted in scientific studies of human nature. It's rooted in assumptions that a bunch of wealthy European dudes just kind of came up with one time before the field of modern psychology existed. Assumptions which, incidentally, were very beneficial to them. I mean, they're just kind of like, hey everyone, we got it all figured out. The only system that could possibly work is one where we get really, really rich.
What a crazy random happenstance.
And we all just kind of believed them. We're like, yeah, okay, that checks out, sure. In reality, human nature is incredibly malleable. In other words, your behavior is shaped by your environment. Which is, in some sense, kind of obvious. You act differently at, say, a basketball game than you would at a funeral. So when people talk about behavior under capitalism and say, it's human nature that people will only work if they're getting paid, I would agree, under capitalism, that behavior is pretty common. But that doesn't mean that that behavior would always be common regardless of the circumstances. Capitalism's understanding of human nature fails to account for the deeper needs of humanity that we now understand much better than we used to. Humans have emotional needs, like a sense of belonging and discovery and social engagement and feelings of contributing to the community that can all motivate people to work. One of the reasons so many of the scientists you learned about in school were nobles, besides institutional racism, is because they had their material needs met, so then they were able to go on and pursue their passion, follow their curiosity. Do you think Isaac Newton would have come up with his laws of motion if he had to do 8 hours of manual labor a day just to survive? I often find myself wondering, what kinds of amazing inventions and discoveries could humanity be capable of if we just committed to meeting every individual's basic needs? So I don't buy this idea that people would just be lazy if all their basic needs were met. In fact, I don't even really believe that laziness exists, only unseen barriers. Devin Price wrote an excellent article about this for Medium a few years back, link in the description. Price, a professor of psychology, posits the idea that laziness is a gross oversimplification that fails to account for the complicated realities of human lives. When someone spends an inordinate amount of time procrastinating or finds it hard to get out of bed, there's a root cause for those behaviors. They don't just happen. I know I, for example, have had times in my life where I've spent months on end just playing video games and finding it hard to get out of bed. And other times when I've worked full-time no problem and felt fine. The problem was not one of laziness, but rather one of understanding the things that were acting as barriers and addressing them. In my case, that was undiagnosed depression, anxiety, ADHD, and a living situation that was a bad fit. And during my several month span where I was completely unproductive, had I not had the privilege to move back in with my parents and get the mental health care that I needed, there's a very real chance I would have ended up homeless. What ultimately pulled me out of my depression was not economic incentives, but seeing a therapist, finding a community, and connecting with friends and family. Part 4. Capitalism is bad for society. The last thing that I want to touch on about capitalism, for now, is that the system completely focuses on individuals, and in doing so, it kind of misses the bigger picture. Like, the goal of capitalism is not rooted in the interests of humanity as a whole, but in the interests of individuals within the system. Capitalism views the world strictly in terms of economic producers and consumers. It makes the assumption that if something is good for the producer and good for the consumer, then it must be good for society as a whole. And on the surface, that kind of makes sense, but it doesn't always hold up to scrutiny. Capitalism encourages something called an externalization of costs. Externalizing a cost is when you jettison as much of the cost of production of a product as possible onto society as a whole rather than just paying it as an individual. Like, for example, part of the cost to society of creating, Oreos is an increase in the number of cavities that people are likely to develop. Nabisco externalizes this cost onto our healthcare system. They're not paying for the increase in dental procedures that are going to happen because of the sale of their products. If they had to pay that, then they would be incentivized to figure out a way for Oreos to taste good without being bad for your teeth. This is just one really basic example, but once you start looking for it, you realize that this happens everywhere. The most common ways that people generally talk about externalization of costs often have to do with public health outcomes or environmental concerns, but I would argue that the same idea could actually be kind of extrapolated out, and you could talk about like how a comedy movie might externalize part of its cost onto, say, the trans community by making a transphobic joke. Right? They didn't have to consider the broader implications to society of the product that they were making. They were just profiting off of it. So you might be thinking now, well, as long as the right people are rich, they won't externalize costs, right? So we just need to make sure that the right people have money and we'll be okay. And yeah, okay, let's play that idea out. So imagine you, a morally upstanding, righteous person, you own a factory. You have to decide how you are going to dispose of your waste products. Now, you can do something that's very cheap for you, but may have negative consequences on the environment, or you can do something that's more expensive, but has less environmental impact. You, being the moral, upstanding person that you are, decide that you're not going to cut any corners. You're going to do it the right way. Well, now your competitors come along. They see an opportunity. Because you've chosen the environmentally sustainable option, your products cost more. I mean, you are, after all, a business. You can't very well sell your product for a loss. So they build a factory producing a similar product for cheaper, and because they were able to externalize some of their costs onto the environment, they undersell you and dominate the market. A lot of people think the solution is to regulate industries, to legislate the problems away. And yeah, I can understand where they're coming from, but history has showed us that the time between when a cost is externalized and when we're able to enact legislation to regulate it is often long enough for some very serious damage to be done. Here's an example. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we've had 44 major oil spills of 10,000 gallons or more since 1969, and yet we continue to build new pipelines. Like, legislating things away isn't working. It's not enough. Capitalism encourages people to seek maximum externalization because it's a framework that focuses on the prosperity of the individual rather than society as a whole. I want to make something clear. If you look at the overall cost to society, externalization tends to produce net negatives. Like, no amount of making the product cheaper for the consumer is worth the literal destruction of our planet.
Conclusion.
This video is getting pretty long, so rather than just tell you what I think a better system would look like, this seems like a great place for some personal exploration. I'm going to leave you with a question to ponder. What might a society look like where all people's basic needs are met, innovation is encouraged as a primary goal rather than a secondary effect, our modern understanding of human motivation and emotional needs is accounted for, and cost externalization isn't present? Big thank you to everyone who stepped outside of their comfort zone with me here. That's like really, really hard to do, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. Sincerely. As always, if you want to support my channel, you can like, comment, or subscribe. And, see you next time.